1, 2.
I will tell lightly. Just a moment. They need to set up it.
One, two, 1, 2, 1, 2.
I will stand here and listen. If it needs more, then I will tell them.
Okay. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My great honor and pleasure to open the book launch event. My name is Martin Kahanec. I'm the head of the Department of Public Policy here at CU. I'm also acting as the director of its Shattuck Center for Human Rights. Welcome to those in the room here, but also those who are watching us online. Very warm welcome wherever you are. Good afternoon, maybe good morning to those watching us from the US. I'm very pleased to see many colleagues, many students, alumni, and many distinguished guests. Let me very warmly welcome Her Excellency, Madam Ambassador Kennedy. We are very pleased to have you here. And I'm also very delighted we have not one rector today, we have two rectors today. Here we have John Shattuck, of course, and we have Shalini Randeria, the present rector. And yeah, some small rules here. You should turn off your cell phones. You can mute them. Alternatively, you can call all your friends and acquaintances not to call you in the next hour and a half, so that we can concentrate on the business today, which is a very special day for DPP, Department of Public Policy, and the university, and the Shattuck Center in particular. It marks our commitment to human rights, social justice, and freedom, and this is very much in CU story and what we are doing in our daily lives. It also marks our department's dedication to academic excellence, commitment to human rights, social justice, study of public policy, innovative teaching and research, dedicated evidence-based and rights over engagement with policy practice. before the book launch lecture by John, let me say a few words about the John Shattuck Center for Human Rights and its reorientation. We've been working on this in some time with colleagues. An excellent work has been done by the John Shattuck Center previously under its former name, the Shattuck Center on Conflict Negotiation and Recovery. On Syria, it was a wonderful Aleppo project, and I'd like to thank all of those of you and those who are not present who have contributed to that successful mission. But there's been changes, and as every institution should be, there should be innovation in an institution, and as the landscape of all the challenges are changing, we need to respond, and this is what we've been doing on the John's recommendation and advice and under his guidance. We realized that there are major challenges for countries emerging from periods of conflict or that are making the transition away from authoritarian forms of government to which should be the main focus of the center for several years, to build and strengthen democratic institutions, establish or re-establish the rule of law, and to pursue accountability for past and present violation of human rights. So that's been changing, and what has changed also is that there's been a major shift towards populism. We've seen this in many countries around the world, in Europe as well, and there have been attacks on democratic institutions and the rule of law, those institutions which support the rule of law. There's been at the same time shift in the geopolitical situation and the transatlantic relationships, and this reveals an international environment that is less rather than more supportive of building and maintaining institutions that promote social justice, and that is in respect of for human rights, equal opportunities, the fair distribution of resources, and more generally equal participation in society. So on the impulse and under the guidance of John, with much appreciated support from Rector Shalini Randeria and her predecessor Michael Ignatieff, and a lot of input from colleagues. I want to mention Kirsten Roberts-Lear, Marie-Pierre Granger, Mate Nicola Tokic. Thanks very much for that intellectual input that you kindly provided in that process. Constructive early discussion with our colleagues from the Democracy Institute, Laci Brust and Eva Fodor, and also much valued support from Vice President Trisha Tanner. The John Shattuck Center, and I'm very pleased to announce that, will be reoriented as an interdisciplinary hub for practical engagement on issues related to human rights and social justice in global governance and civic administration, and what we aspire to do, a cutting-edge laboratory for joint research, curriculum development, and teacher training in these areas. Named in John Shattuck's honor, the reoriented Shattuck Center, we hope that we will be able to support that mission that will carry forward John's lifelong dedication to these topics of human rights and civil liberties. And the work of the center has been made possible through the support of a group of friends and colleagues of John, to whom we are immensely indebted for the continued support. And that these are not just words, there is some evidence already that we've been doing some job already, not only writing, thinking and writing papers and spending time discussing what we could do. We have already done something. I'm very pleased to announce that we have won a project which is several $100,000 of euros. It's a very inspiring project because it's a collaborative project with the European University Institute, with National University of Ireland in Galway and Matej Bell University in Slovakia. It's a twinning project horizon. And of course, what's the topic? Exactly, democracy, building human rights. And we want to, together with this institution, create a hub and a focal point for these topics. So it's 1.5 million, and for our university department, it's about 400,000 euros. So that's certainly helpful. Now, turning to the book launch, this has been a bit of an introduction on the John Shattuck Center and its reorientation, but what's the better way to mark this occasion of reorientation than having John with us today the center's namesake, John Shattuck, launching his new book on holding together the hijacking of democracy in America and how to reclaim it. I guess we all understand this is a major, major topic. We feel it everywhere. And the book does tackle this key question, which is how can we make our societies work? Ensure that rights can bring citizens together instead of tearing societies apart. In a world, we have to admit, of many centrifugal forces which are dividing societies and which put rights of citizens in danger and which create exclusive environments where people don't get their rights and where people actually are put in at various kinds of risk and danger. John, we're very pleased to have you here. Before I invite you on stage, there's a couple of words I'd like to say about you. We all know John too well, but let me just say that John served as the president and rector of our university from 2009 to 2016. That's when I joined the university, 2010. I actually was an alum of the university, but John wasn't yet here. That was in 2000, where I graduated from the economics department. He's a professor of practice at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy and senior fellow at the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at Harvard. His distinguished career spans higher education, international diplomacy, foreign policy, and human rights, including service as U.S. ambassador to the Czech Republic and as Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor under President Clinton. John, we're very, very pleased to have you over here, and please, the floor is yours for the book launch.
Thank you very much, Martin. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to come back, even though coming back means coming to a different place, which is an interesting proposition in life. It always does. But coming here to Vienna, Ellen and I are thrilled to be here. I want to particularly recognize our dear friend and the ambassador of the United States to Austria, Victoria Reggie Kennedy, who is here with us tonight, today. For some people, maybe tonight. In any event, we got to know each other very well when I was directing the Kennedy Library Foundation. And Ambassador Kennedy was a frequent visitor. And of course, her late husband, Senator Edward Kennedy, was one of my greatest mentors in the whole field that Martin has talked about here. And I was just whispering to Vicky, if I may say, as we were getting ready to come up here, so much of what I learned about human rights really came from that experience, with many debates with Senator Kennedy as well. So let me thank, above all, Madam Rector, Shalini Randeria, who has so kindly invited me and a predecessor to return to CEU. That's a very, very wonderful gesture. We are particularly pleased to be here in that way. And thank you. I also want to thank certainly Martin Kahanec, Kirsten Roberts-Lyer, Tricia Tanner, and others from the CEU faculty and administration who have helped shape the mission of the Shattuck Center, the new mission that has been described to you by Martin. And let me also thank Inji Kassem and Andrea Ortiz, who have done so much to make our visit to Vienna and back to CEU such a wonderful homecoming. So here we are. So I want to talk a little bit about a topic that all of us think about frequently, and certainly here at CEU, probably more than even most people, which is all the attacks on democracy and human rights that are taking place in the world today. I won't talk about all of them, don't worry, but I want to talk about three of them to start, because they represent, in a sense, the three models of attack that we see today in Europe and in the United States. The first model, of course, is authoritarian violence that Vladimir Putin unleashed 3 months ago against the people of Ukraine. Violent aggression, as we know, is the ultimate instrument of coercion, and waging a war of aggression is the most extreme form of criminal conduct in the world, equal to crimes against humanity and genocide, which are also being committed in Ukraine. Putin's war was certainly a wake-up call for Europeans and Americans who have too long taken for granted, I think, our security and democracy, and the stakes are enormous. I think of what I first learned, a great phrase from Thucydides: the strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. If this war is to succeed, if Putin succeeds, the rule of force would overwhelm the rule of law. We know that. International relations could be permanently militarized in many different areas, not just the military one that we're thinking of, maybe other aspects of human relations like trade or culture or religion. So crimes of aggression, crimes against humanity, and genocide could become a new norm in world affairs. So Putin, I think, has made very clear that that's his goal, in the sense that that's the kind of impact that he hopes to have, in particularly on the people of Ukraine, and Ukraine whose national and cultural identity he wants to wipe out. So that's the easy one, in the sense that it's so clearly recognizable. But let's take a harder one that's closer at hand, and we know well too. CEU probably knows better than most. The second model of attack is what I call Viktor Orban's non-violent hijacking, less visible, more insidious than Putin's violent authoritarianism, and now a symbol of how easily democracy can be overwhelmed from within. So Orban has really built his model by being the first modern European leader to polarize a society by refusing to negotiate with political opponents, intentionally destroying a democratic culture that Hungary was just beginning to take hold in Hungary. He's done this, of course, by targeting opponents as enemies of the people, stirring up the politics of fear, fear of outsiders, fear of migrants, fear of Muslims, by hollowing out democratic institutions, by changing their rules and disregarding their norms, by gerrymandering the legislature, rewriting the constitution, politicizing the judiciary, taking over the media, controlling the universities, criminalizing NGOs, rewarding state contracts to cronies, and distributing EU funds to oligarchs. So while Putin's attack on Ukraine briefly weakened Orban's appeal across Europe, his remarkable, and I have to pay tribute to his remarkable capacities as a politician, his political jujitsu at home, in which he criticized the Ukrainian invasion very effectively, while guaranteeing Hungary's continued access to Russian energy, allowed him to coast to re-election, as we know, and made him an even more attractive model for the transatlantic far right. But I think that Orban's position on Ukraine will haunt him. It will haunt him, as Ukrainian Prime Minister Volodymyr Zelensky pointedly called out in saying that Orban was effectively facilitating Putin's aggression by refusing to assist Ukraine. And I'll paraphrase what Zelensky said. Zelensky told Orban to look to the sculptures of shoes that you can see from the Hungarian parliament on the banks of the Danube, that remind you genocide was committed in Hungary and is now being committed in Ukraine. Now, a third model, closer to home, and this gets to the topic of my book, is Donald Trump's insurrection model, which really draws from the Putin and Orban models. And here's how the Trump model works. Use the electoral process to take control, but only if you win. If you lose, refuse to accept defeat, deny the peaceful transition of power, promote lies and disinformation about election fraud, and stimulate political violence. That's the book. Like the Orban model, the insurrection model involves building an extremist political base by stirring up popular fears, promoting false narratives about racial threats, and polarizing the electorate by targeting opponents in the media as enemies of the people. As president, Trump followed the Orban model by refusing to negotiate with opponents, suppressing voters who oppose him, using the White House to spread lies, accusing the press of reporting fake news, attacking civil servants as part of a deep state, and taking over the Supreme Court through political appointments. Viktor Orban's influence on the American far right, I think, is the key to understanding Donald Trump in many ways. Last weekend, many of you read, Orban urged the Trump-dominated U.S. National Conservative Political Action Committee at its convention in Budapest to, and I quote, "follow your own rules, not the rules of others, when you're trying to take power." Now, Trump has followed Orban's advice, but Putin also has had an influence on Trump because the Putin model calls for the use of violence, and Trump knows the U.S. is fertile ground for that. So that's the bad news. Now, where's the good news? There is some good news in my book, and I'll get to it. How susceptible are Americans to the, and I'm only here talking about Americans, to the Putin and Orban and Trump models of attacks on democracy? The answer, of course, depends on how committed Americans are to democratic values, and that's the focus of our book, and here's how I approach that question. Unlike nations in Europe, which are built on common ancestry often, the US has been built differently. It's been built on immigration, it's been built on the legacy of slavery, and it's been built on the subjugation of its indigenous people. That's its history. We know that. Americans have been thrown together over the centuries by chance and by exploitation. But here's the rub. They have actually been held together, and so have other nations in some ways, by a promise. And the promise is that of rights, even when rights are denied or attacked. And it was first expressed in the famous 18th century declaration that, and I quote, "all people are created equal and have rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Now, we know that the men who wrote that sentence had a narrow view of rights, rights only for white men with property, like themselves. So there's been a long struggle since those early days of the American Republic to deal with this historic exclusion, a struggle that's been punctuated by racism, by bloodshed, by civil war, of course, by segregation, and through it all, by movements of the people. Ultimately, in many cases, a majority of the people, to win the right to vote, to equal protection and equal opportunity, freedom of speech and religion, individual dignity and autonomy, due process of law, and a democratic form of government. That is what the struggle has been all about. And this struggle, with its constant advances and setbacks, defines what it is to be an American, I believe. So the central question of the book is, what do Americans today believe about their rights? And to find out, we conducted a series of town hall meetings around the country, in different parts of the country, Atlanta, Phoenix, Detroit in particular, and then 2 major national polls of a diverse sample of 2,000 Americans by the National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago, probably one of the most respected nonpartisan polling institutions in the US. What we found out was quite remarkable. I'm going to give you some of the results. The majority of Americans have a complex view of their rights in a democracy and believe that rights actually include responsibilities to others and to the public. 75% agree, for example, that personal freedom should be balanced against a responsibility to keep people safe in a pandemic, even though an aggressive 25% on the right, largely, rejects mask wearing and COVID restrictions. On the other side, on the left, a similar majority of Americans agree that the police should be held accountable when they violate civil rights, and that a well-trained police are essential for protecting public security, even though a minority on the left say they want to defund or significantly reduce the capacity of the police to do some of its work because of the violations that have been taking place. 7 out of 10 agree that the US should automatically register all citizens to vote, like almost all other countries in the world do, rather than simply requiring them to go and get a registration. And that, voting is both a right and a responsibility of citizenship, even though a minority, about 30%, on the right, want to restrict voting. So we see the majority poking its head out and trying to make it clear that it doesn't see things the way things are going on the far left or the far right. Most Americans reject the culture wars that are being fought at the political extremes because they don't live at the extremes. Most people don't live at the extremes. They live across the broad political center, and this is not only true in the US, but other countries as well. 72% of Americans say they're fed up with polarization, that politicians are intentionally dividing our country. And one of the most important findings is the majority of Americans would like to move beyond polarizing politicians like Orban and Trump and are looking for ways to balance competing interests. 3 quick examples. They want to balance gun rights against public safety. And they're desperate to get action in the US Congress on this, which is completely tied up by polarization. They want to regulate guns while protecting the right to own guns. They recognize the Second Amendment to the US Constitution provides that, and this is about 70%. They want to balance religious freedom against non-discrimination by protecting women and minorities from discrimination while respecting religious beliefs, and that's about 70%. They want to balance freedom of expression and disinformation, this great problem that we have in the world of all of the false information that's being promoted through social media, et cetera. But they want to do this while protecting freedom of speech. This is probably the hardest thing to do, but it can be done. There are ways to do it. And in fact, in some ways, Europe, the European Union, has led the way through the development of something called the Digital Services Act, that many of you know about, just passed about 2 weeks ago, that requires algorithmic transparency of social media companies to figure out how it is that they're purveying so much disinformation. So what we found that the pandemic over the last 2 years, the COVID crisis, has stimulated public support for economic rights in the United States, a surprising development. The US is usually far lagged behind, certainly behind Europe and many other countries, in recognizing the importance of a right to health care, something that Senator Kennedy throughout his life championed. The right to housing, the right to education, all now favored by about 75% of the American population. And I think this should open the way for a political coalition to implement these economic rights by enacting policies to reduce wealth inequality. But there's a long way between having the public support that and actually getting it implemented. The bottom line of our polling, remarkable, I believe, is that a large majority of Americans support the civil rights advances that have been won, particularly over the last 50 years, many of them through lots of struggle of various groups, certainly struggle by people of color, Americans of various minorities, by struggle by women, struggle by LGBTQ people, and just generally the pressure for more rights. 70% support these rights that have been gained. And we call this the silent majority in our book, to steal a phrase that any Americans here would recognize coming from the Richard Nixon era, but we call it our silent majority. Our silent majority is demographically and politically very diverse. There are indeed Republicans as well as Democrats and independents in this. People who disagree on politics but say they have a common commitment to democratic values, and that commitment comes through in our polling. I think this silent majority has the potential to hold American democracy together, but its diversity keeps it from being politically cohesive, and it's often overshadowed by a much more homogeneous and extremist minority that's undermining democracy. And this extremist minority is about 30%, made up of a mostly white constituency motivated by fear and grievance to destroy the equal rights of others they see as threats to their own racial, cultural, or political dominance. In some cases, these fears are real, but more often than not, they are stimulated by the kinds of political maneuvering that I described earlier from an Orban or from a Trump. Their major objective has been overturning the results of the 2020 presidential election. That through political lies and disinformation that led to the January 6th violent insurrection at the Capitol, and having failed to do that, they're now trying to rule the US or have a big impact on the US as a political minority. And they benefit from structural flaws in American democracy, like the disproportionate power of rural states with low populations and the Senate filibuster rule that allows a political minority to block legislation. They're trying to impose minority rule by manipulating institutions that were designed to check, not promote destructive power. They're made up of four groups: political entrepreneurs like Trump and many, many others. Trump is only the tip of the iceberg in this respect, who promote lies and fears to attack enemies and keep their followers in line. Supporters who oppose equal rights as a threat to their dominance. The third group are the extremist media and social media that can spread disinformation, and indeed that have, in some cases, stimulated the violent attacks like the 200 mass shootings that have taken place in the US this year. I'm not blaming them all on the social media, to be sure, but the stimulation of attacks, and we've seen this time and again in some of the information coming out of who the attackers are, suggests that there is disinformation that has been stimulating them. The fourth group is probably the most interesting because they're the most surprising, and because they are also a group that has been the source of a lot of advancement of rights in the United States, and that's the federal courts, and particularly the Supreme Court of the United States, where a majority has emerged, the core members of whom were appointed by a president who twice lost the popular vote, Donald Trump, and are now beginning to dismantle rights that a majority of Americans want to see protected, such as a woman's right to choose when and how to bear a child. The extremist minority is attacking the entire US electoral process, but it's doing so from a really small base, as I've said, that is to say about 30%. But that base is very powerful in certain states. 19 states with very strong Trump-dominated legislatures have enacted 35 new state laws that make it harder to vote in the US. But our polls show, as I've suggested, that a great majority of Americans want to strengthen, not weaken, voting rights. The same thing is true with respect to the rights of women, racial minorities, LGBTQ people that are also under severe attack. I mentioned, of course, the expected decision by the US Supreme Court, a draft of which has come forth indicating that the right to choose whether to bear a child is likely to be overturned by the court. This is completely out of step with public opinion because 72% in our poll say that a woman's right to make decisions affecting her body and her personal life should be protected. So on and on. So looking ahead, and let me close on this set of observations. There are three directions that the battle over rights and democracy might take in the US. Only one of them is acceptable and the way forward. The first, extremist violence, could continue to rise, raising, as some have said, the specter of civil war. I don't believe that's likely, but it is nonetheless an avenue that one has to consider. The second, in a sense, more likely, but even there I think is problematic, the extremist minority that I've been talking about here may soften its image in order to broaden its appeal. But I think the escalating violence that we've seen, particularly after the January 6th attack and the Supreme Court's decisions cutting back basic rights, may prevent the extremist minority from expanding to get its base broader. And indeed, what might indeed expand, and we certainly hope that this is the third alternative where the silent majority may actually grow and may be able to mobilize a democracy movement to reduce polarization through cross-partisan alliances. And this is the key. Cross-partisan alliances, working as a democracy inevitably has to work to make compromises, to find ways not to get everything that you want, but to get something that you need. I think there's nothing more obvious than the gun rights battle that's taking place right now with respect to compromise, that there's no way that the US is going to abolish all guns or even take away all handguns or deal with guns in many states. But it is quite possible, if the silent majority that I've described is able to mobilize itself into an organization or at least a movement that is willing to look at things like a ban on assault weapons and a ban on multi-firing carbines and various other kinds of things, that might reflect progress. The biggest challenge, I think, is overcoming polarization. But here I'm going to go back for a moment just to one thing that I mentioned earlier, which I think is the greatest possible ray of light that we can shed in this book. And that is that I think the populist outrage, and I use that word carefully, that's expressed across the political spectrum by people of limited means, by workers and many others, of the country's growing wealth inequality, the outrage at inequality and the possibility that that might lead, especially if the 75% who now agree that there is a right to health care and education and housing, as I said, to changes in what I would regard, and some in this room may take issue or some may applaud, as the neoliberal economic straitjacket that continues to have such an impact on American policymaking. And what could happen is that this cross-partisan coalition could come together to demand a more effective and more equal way of addressing public policy in areas involving economic rights. So there are many areas that I could go through, and the book does. Certainly social media, as I mentioned before, dealing with the privacy of personal data in a way that has been done so effectively in Europe and needs to be done now more in the United States. Anyway, so there are many aspects of this, but I'm going to close with the words of the late American civil rights leader, John Lewis, about his decades-long struggle to defend democracy and civil rights against attacks by segregationists in the 1960s and then extending all the way up till today, just before he died, against the insurrectionists of today. John Lewis was a target of these attacks for more than half a century, and his words remind us, and I quote, "Democracy is not a state, it is an act. It is not some enchanted garden perched high on a distant plateau where we can finally sit down and rest. Democracy is the continuous action we all must take, and every generation must do its part." So let me echo those words by closing with what I always said to CEU students at the end of each year's graduation. Everybody was worried that I was going to give another speech, but I'd get up and I'd say, I have 6 words: go forth and save the world. And that's how I will end.
John, congratulations. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and launching the book. Now, everybody in the room may be wondering, why are we sitting so far apart? And why do we have 4 chairs in between us? Well, there is actually an important point I want to make here, and that is we at CUC is known for having leading international scholars, academics here, but we also boast fantastic, curious, motivating, and inspiring students. And we want to hear from them. We want to invite them on stage. So please, Anastasia, Ilana, Vadim, Hongdo, please come over, join us. So let me introduce students present here. Anastasia Tarasova, who's a second-year master student in the Master of Arts in International Public Affairs program. She's from Ukraine, and her interests are peace building, humanitarian relief, and development. I welcome Ilana Beatriz Marroquin, who's from El Salvador. She's a first-year master student in the Master of Public Administration program. She advocated for human rights by directing a grassroots fundraising campaign for Amnesty International USA. Vadim Naiko, sitting next to me. Vadim is an MPA student from Ukraine, and his specialization is in quantitative policy analysis. His interests are labor migration and rights of immigrants, political and civil rights. And Hongdo, who is a PhD candidate in political science, political theory track. She's from Vietnam, and her research is on global public reason and participatory global governance. She's working on a model of transnational deliberative innovation. Thanks very much for joining us on stage. And I have some questions for you, and then then you will be asked to ask a question, ask John a question. What's your own engagement? In a few words, what's your own engagement with human rights as a student at CU, or maybe also in the practice? And let me start with Anastasia. Would you mind starting and please share your story?
Good afternoon. Here at the university, I took the courses in the human rights and humanitarian law. But before this, I already came with some practice, knowledge and skills in human rights. I worked for OIC in Ukraine, in Dnipro region that was very close to the conflict-affected region of Donbass. And I supported the human dimension focal point, and I worked in particular with internally displaced people and participated here in the realization on the project on the narratives in conflict. People could tell their stories, how conflict changed their lives, how it affected it. And now with the start of full-scale war in Ukraine, I practice here also human rights, supporting our displaced people. Thank you.
Thanks, Anastasia. Hongdo, would you mind sharing yours, please?
So hello, everyone. And first, I would like to say thank you to Martin and also to John for the opportunity. It's just like very much beyond my imaginations, because I think 10 years ago, I was in the internet cafe in Vietnam watching your YouTube video. That was the Conversation with History series. And so human rights, to me, especially in the global context, is such a big motivation for my whole dissertation project. Because when I was studying international relations in Vietnam, I read about human rights, and I thought that it seems like everyone agree that human rights matter, but at the same time we disagree about the substantive content, the application, and interpretation of human rights. And then one country can claim that we have human rights, and then their citizens can also agree that we also feel that we enjoy human rights, but then that country can also be ranked in the bottom of the list of the Human Rights Watch. And it seems to me that there's something going on. Why we disagree so much? Why we agree that it does matters. It matters to everyone because we are human. And now when I'm doing my research at CEU, the puzzle that now I'm trying to investigate is perhaps the issues of the state-centric models of human rights. To me, it is the issue that now human rights has been seen as state-centric models. It had been seen as a triggers for external interventions, and then somehow benchmarked for the legitimacy of a national state, but not so much about, let's put in John terms, holding together as a community, as individuals, everyone as activists, claiming and holding and explaining the rights to each other, and somehow promote human rights in more of like communitarian terms as a global community.
Thanks, Ando. Ilana, over to you. You need to turn it on. Yes. No, it was okay. It was okay. Leave it like that.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. So as Professor Kahanec mentioned, my background is in Amnesty International, making a fundraising campaign for migrant families. And why did this happen to me? Is because I am a migrant myself. I migrated from El Salvador to the United States 5 years ago. So once I arrived, I thought, should I go and pursue a career on economics because that's my background? But suddenly this, the former administration with Trump, it was messing with the Salvadoran community. So I started to realize that there was a huge gap in making advocacy and raising awareness on what was happening. So I decided to took that path. And in that campaign, I realized that yes, there are minorities, but there are also minorities that been I don't know, traced, that are also transgender women that are seeking asylum in the United States. So that took me to take here in CEU the first course that I ever had in human rights with Professor Roberts, and that's what I researched. And I found that there are many NGOs all over the Americas that are working these kind of topics. So I was very motivated, and it was also a big learning piece for me presently.
Thanks, Lana. Vadim?
Thank you. Probably my engagement with human rights started in high school when I was first reading Ukrainian constitution, and I really like that part of all the description of how many human rights we have. Like, wow, amazing. But what I really didn't like is the part with responsibilities, and I didn't like reading that part as well. But the older I was becoming, the clearer it was becoming to me that actually, if I want to give this rights, I also have some responsibilities. And I remember myself like age 15 with the revolution in 2014 in Ukraine. I wanted to do something to join an organization, but in my small town there was none, like 10,000 people and no youth organization. So I created one, and we were actually like, it was educational kind of organization, also trying to talk about how important are rights, like for especially like for these post-Soviet generations. And yeah, the later just became a habit, you know, like to like to see how important human rights in each area of our life. Then I did my volunteering with people with disabilities. I also went on exchange to the US, where I worked with refugees from all around the world. It was very interesting. And this summer, I will be joining a project organized by CU, American University of Afghanistan, and Williams College. We'll be traveling across Europe, working with refugees from Afghanistan, from Ukraine, and we'll be drawing from the experiences how different and how similar at the same time they are, and trying to prove that human rights are universal, disregarding what color is your skin and what is your religion.
Thanks very much, Vadim. Now, let's see, from your experience, what's your answer to John? How can we save the world? Of course, that's a big question. Yes, that's a big question. But I'm sure from experience there are some aspects, some kind of points that you like to make. What do you think is important? What is the specific aspect that you learn from your experience? That's a very important thing. Hongdo, would you mind starting with this one?
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's a solution to save the world, but perhaps something is just, I have a very strong statement for that, because I heard you talking about how to reforming the voting system, the elections and everything. But then to me, it's not like voting is not enough, basically. And then deliberation is something also pretty much matters, especially during this time when we are so divided. We have different opinions, there's so much disagreements. To me, with deliberation, it is a platform not only for discussion, talking about politics in the living room, in parliament, but it's also for the marginalized groups, for females, for indigenous citizens to raise their voice, tell their stories, which is also the value that's going to be lost quickly during the elections, because the majority is going to win and those consistent minority are going to lose constantly. So that is also the thing that I'm working right now, to press the issues of deliberation and create the space for people to participate meaningfully.
Thanks, Anastasia.
Thank you. I would say that when we speak about saving the world, it all starts from humans, ourselves, because I think that in the dark times, we really clearly see light people. And I think it's in dark times when we start speaking about human rights and value and appreciate this. And I think each big thing starts with small steps. Each of us can do the action, and then people, light people, acting, they motivate other people. And it's like a kind of atoms and molecules that are rotating around each other. Thank you.
Thanks, Anastasia. Ilana, would you mind sharing yours?
I will definitely agree with Anastasia, what she mentioned. We see that is global polarization when there was these three like Trump and Orban models, but also in the Americas we have very similar models, with Bukele in El Salvador imitating Orban, and Bolsonaro in Brazil imitating Trump. So I think there are many similarities going on, and answering the question on how we're going to save the world, I think I agree with Anastasia. We need to start with the people, and it has to be from the bottom. We need to get together the academia and the NGOs and make grassroots movement bright again, so we can demand change and also build bridges with dialogue as we are making it today.
Thanks, Lana. Vadim?
So with your last remark about building bridges and the dialogue, that's exactly what I was thinking of. I think through a dialogue, only through talking to people and bringing people together from different parts of the world, we can find a solution, and not only like people from big powers or people from one region. I think what we have at CU here is great. When I was applying here, just one like advertisement seeing that over 100 nationalities on campus, that's what brought my attention first, because just being in a classroom with people from all the continents, various backgrounds and like discuss the things which are so similar for us. And with all the background information we have, like we have such a different perception, but through it's not solvable in 1 hour, in 1 day, but it takes years sometimes. But I think starting this dialogue and keeping it up, that's what's important, because as somebody said, I don't remember who, that democracies either will rise together or fall separately. And I think it's also about people who build these democracies. We either can help each other and be together and rise together, or just do the latter. I think nobody wants the latter.
Thanks. Thanks, Vadim. Now, John asked a difficult question. Now let's retaliate. Let's ask him some difficult questions. What are your questions to him and to the audience? Anastasia, would you mind?
Thank you. If possible, could you please answer? I'm very much interested in your perspective. Like there are lots of mechanisms protecting human rights, because very often when we speak about Orban, Putin, we speak about not a person, but a system. So what is the role of the multinational organizations or intergovernment organizations in countering or somehow acting in the situations when a person rebuilds the system? Should we need a revive maybe?
Let's collect questions and then John, we'll give you time to reflect on them. Yeah, Hongdo, please.
Yeah, I would like to ask you a question, maybe a very general one. So you talk about the domestic context, how people in the United States can hold together. So I would like to ask you about the international context. So how international community, which is more complex, more divided, or to put it like more simple, how to Chinese citizens holding together with American citizens despite different democratic or authoritarian values.
Thanks, Vadim.
So my question will be related to the US. I think that many people look up to the US when they speak about democracies. And to this specific book, you mentioned that disregarding this bipartisan division, over 70% of Americans agree on certain issues. And I think this is the case for many other countries. And you think about the silent majority. Do you think that in order to mobilize it, you mentioned like creating an organization maybe, but do you think that like this bipartisan system can work further, taking into account the polarization, or creation of a new third party, let's say, or power would change the situation faster and better?
Thanks, Ilana.
Thank you. I'm going to take very serious on getting back to him and the question, difficult question. I think with the context of inequality and when we talk about human rights, there is a big challenge on how to, for example, approach youth and tell them like you need to be an activist. Because I definitely agree with the final remarks on John Lewis that democracy is an act. So I will ask you, which will be like that, like activation point for us students, for us that we are going to be advocating in the future for change, how we can enact democracy, transparency, and the defense, like the effective defense of human rights.
Thanks. Now, John, over to you.
Does that work? Hello.
Yes.
Yeah. Very good. Thank you. Well, I asked the big question, and thank you. You've all asked even bigger questions. It's what I should have expected. The big question is, or the big issue is, how to go out and save the world. You know, I think I'm going to come right back home here. You know, you're demonstrating this in many ways by coming here. by this is not necessarily because CEU is going to save the world, but because, as several of you have said, this remarkable collection of and diversity of talents and nations, et cetera, is what we need. We need more of that. Now, that's sort of ideal in a way. How do we get beyond this sort of idealistic view, which is that if people come together, they will work together? That's, I think, human nature, unfortunately, as I've discovered in a very long life, is pretty flawed in some respects, and that we can't expect people to be more than 50% very positive. The other 50% are always going to get in the way. So the real question is, how can we tap into our positive sides here? And I think a number of you have suggested, and I agree with you, that finding your own voice and being active on the issues that are right in front of you is the way to start. And rather than reaching, I think you right, Ileana, asked the question of how do we deal with all these great international human rights organizations that are not accessible to the average person? Well, they weren't intended to be, and I think you shouldn't worry about that. You should worry rather about what's going on in your own community and how can you act on it. And each of you, when I look up and down where you're from and what you've done, your little biographies that you gave us, actually, each of you is a story of action. And you need to carry that story farther and farther and tell other people about it. So I'm not giving you a particularly coherent answer, but I'm giving you a very heartfelt answer, which is this is who you are, and you go out and keep doing what you're doing, and get other people to do it too. And you do it with enthusiasm and excitement, and don't ever give up. Don't take the position, which so many people do, that the world is falling apart and it's sort of the pessimism is so all around us that we can't do anything about it. That's not true. And again, I've lived such a wonderful long life that I've seen many situations where everything seemed hopeless and was never going to, we thought at one point in the United States that many, many years ago that we had a president who was likely to destroy our Constitution. Well, guess what? He had to leave office for various reasons. I'm not going to go into all of that. His name was Richard Nixon. There are many, many other examples. The war in Bosnia, which I was deeply involved in the sense of trying to end it, one thought it would never end. And there were hundreds of thousands of people who lost their lives, and it was horrific. It was, in a sense, the Ukraine of the time. But it ended, and it ended because a lot of people came together to make it end. So stay with it, and I'm sure you will make a difference.
Thanks. Thank you very much, John, and thanks so much, students. Please remain seated. I invite Madam Rector Shalini Randeria to take my place. Just stay where you are. I think this is fine to have students in between two rectors, the present rector and the former rector. That looks just so lovely. I cannot resist that.
Thanks, Martin. So Martin and I are just swapping places and roles for the final act of this afternoon. So John, thank you very much, and thank you to all of you. I'll just give the word to the audience who has been patiently listening to all of us. Just two quick points which struck me while listening to you, and I don't know whether you want to immediately respond to them or we can discuss these later. After we finish, there is a reception, so please join us for some food and drinks later. In case I forget to say the most important thing, I'm going to say it now. So John, two quick thoughts. One, listening to you about the role of courts, I was just thinking there is something Janus faced about law itself. It can be used as a progressive or a regressive instrument. So it can foster rights, it can also dismantle rights. And one of the ambivalences of the ever increasing role of law and courts has been a judicialization of politics on the one hand, but a politicization of the judiciary on the other hand. So I think we need to think about what should be the relationship, especially because we are thinking about shoring up rights, right? So the increasing use of courts has come at a price. And part of it is judicial activism from below, part of it is activist courts. And I think a balance there is something that would be a fourth balance to add to the balances you're thinking about. The other thing which struck me listening to you was the whole question of voice. So I'm thinking now with Albert Hirschman, for example, think about exit, voice, and loyalty. What you're getting, in a sense, I mean, one of the main arguments in your book is about there is so much of support for furthering a rights agenda, and yet that doesn't translate into the policy that we are looking for, not only in the US. Look at the climate question, you see that all over Europe as well. So popular support not translating into policy. So obviously there's something which we are missing in this story. But so one of the things you pointed out is the influence of money in elections. And that is what, in a sense, Lawrence Lessing, right? He's talking about the economies of influence. So this is about an oversized voice. And the question is, given that, how do we amplify the voice of the 70% that you have managed to unearth? It's a very substantive majority. It's not a small majority. The question is the lack of amplification of that voice as opposed to the oversized voice on the other hand. So I think that's another balance that one needs to think of. And those were just two little remarks on a wonderful talk, and I really enjoyed reading the book.
Two very wise comments. Neither of them will get an answer that, and both of them deserve much more than I will say. But I do think that you've raised the basic question, Shalini, of the issue of representation versus direct involvement. And right now we're pressing, we think, for more direct involvement, because what works through representation and through the institutions, whether they're international, like the human rights organizations that Ileana mentioned, or whether they're national, like the various institutions of government in the United States or Congress, whatever, they're not working. They're not working for a whole variety of reasons. And, there are formal structural reasons, but they're not working because people's voices don't get heard. And I think your second point, which is the subject of a large part of our book, we call it Money in Politics, is part of an answer to that. How can we reduce the role of large amounts of money that are coming through a few people or a few organizations or corporate enterprises or what have you? And there's no specifically simple solution to that, but there are a variety of practical solutions, including public financing of elections, which is something that's being pursued in the United States, particularly at some urban levels, and transparency, much greater transparency of where the money is coming from and where it's going. Right now, there's insufficient transparency. But then I throw it back to the students and to my own answer to how do you act here. Everybody needs to get involved. You cannot simply rely on what's going on out there from some movement that you've heard about that you hope is going to save you. You've got to press for these things. And direct representation direct involvement in politics is essential, but that doesn't mean everybody is going to show up to write the new regulations about social media. So we do need experts, and that's in part what's happening here at CEU. So it's a complicated story, but both of those questions are critical. Thank you.
So let me open now to everybody who's been listening patiently to all of us and ask for questions. We need to pass the mic to you somehow, because there are people who are not in the room who are also listening to us. Yes, there.
Very much. It's a pleasure to see you again. Nice to see you, Andre.
Testing, testing.
Okay.
Pleasure to see you again after working with you a bit in Budapest. And this is such an important topic with regards to safeguarding rights and how to work together. And I think it's also good that it's being held at the Central European University, because education is such a big part of being able to have the context to act for our rights. I know in your book you talk about civic education, and the role. I was wondering if you could perhaps expand, and perhaps some of the students expand on the value of a humanities education and the challenges now in an environment where that type of education is being dismissed in favor of science and technology and things that are specifically directed towards a career. Is our educational system perhaps guiding people in a short-sighted manner to nose to the grindstone, do the things that will keep your head above water, rather than imparting the type of values and the understanding of cultures and the ability to apply humanities, and applied humanities is now a field, to apply humanities in a way that enables us to create the type of electorate that values rights and values other cultures and values the minorities that live within an environment. So if you could expound a little bit on what's happening with education and how do we create that environment where humanities are valued?
Sure. It's always a pleasure to see Andre, good friend, former DCM in the U.S. Embassy in Austria.
Hungary.
Oh, in Hungary. I know, I forgot which country I'm in now. Thank you. In any event, sure, but I'm not going to expound at any length. I'll give you one data point, which is pretty staggering, and that is the budget, the federal support for civic education, broadly speaking, including support for humanities and social sciences, was cut drastically on a bipartisan basis. This is not something that we can blame on any one party or the other, in favor of the STEM approach, the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, which is all understandable in a sense, but disastrous in terms of educating citizens to have any understanding of what their rights and responsibilities of citizenship are. And that shows up in a lot of questions that are asked these days of students. For example, only about 40% of American graduating seniors were able easily, of high school, to identify the various elements of the federal government. And by that, I don't mean all the agencies. I mean the Congress, the Supreme Court, the federal courts, the presidency, et cetera, the executive branch. So you've raised a very important point. And I think there is a movement back in the other direction now. The problem is the polarization in the Congress is making it less likely than it should be that the movement will succeed.
Thank you so much for this lecture. I have a very short but very complicated question, because you mentioned that democracy is an action and permanent action. And at the same time, you mentioned all these challenges that the American society and other societies are facing now. And you excluded the possibility of civil war, but instead you hope for finding a compromise. But what if we are having a situation when democracy is needed to be protected by using power of guns? and those producing certain kind of violence. And in such regard, like, what should we do when we have the situation? Would you support the use of guns in order to protect democracy? And what would you recommend to do in a case when the guns are used in order to protect democracy, but at a certain point, the situation when this protection of democracy is transferred into the violence that may be seen as non-democratic arise, but you nevertheless see that you'd like to support this thing in order to, like, fight against those who like to destroy democracy, but at the same time preserve the democratic foundations in the state. Thank you.
Should ask that question of Abraham Lincoln, who was, of course, the American president during the Civil War. And he wrestled with the question. There's no and he and many others who took the nation to war in order to save it. And that's a paradox, of course. How do you take a nation to war in order to save it? And there were terrible consequences in the short term of the decision to go to war, including the suspension of some basic civil rights, like the right, what we call it in the United States, the right to habeas corpus, the right to be able to petition to get out of prison, etc. But in the long term, of course, this was a critical decision that did, in fact, not only save the American democracy, but in many respects is at the heart of the movement to expand American democracy. Had there been no decision, or had there been a decision to allow the slaveholding states in the South to secede and to become a different nation, not only would the nation have been destroyed, but the whole civil rights development of the United States would have been denied. So I don't say that to make this an easy sound like an easy answer. It's not an easy answer, and this was wrestled with by generations of Americans as they approached the one civil war we've had in this country. But we have had a civil war, so we this country, that country. We have had a civil war, and the experience is chastening. I don't know what it will do today were we to get into this situation again. And I personally, based on all of my studies, I don't believe we will. Partly because I think we're dealing with what I've said all throughout is a relatively small minority of extremists who want to press for the use of weapons now, if they and who want to use weapons in these situations.
John, will you take a couple more questions? So I have Serge and I have one question there. No, he's been waiting.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the presentation, John. Thank you, students. Thank you, everyone participating here. My name is Pavel. I'm a master's student at the CEU Department of Public Policy. And I wanted to ask you a question because what seemed to me that you rather talk about the democratic states when you were saying that there is a possibility for us to make small actions that matter. But what if we're talking about authoritarian states where even the small action is such heavily suppressed by the governments that even doing this is very dangerous to you, very dangerous to your relatives, and the authoritarian states does whatever it needs to suppress your rights to democracy and any other civil rights. So my question is there any alternative to this smaller action, and how can we talk about the rather authoritarian states in the sense? So I know it's a bit tricky question, but I'm coming from Russia, and this is the question I'm particularly interested in. So if you could answer this, I would be very grateful. Thank you.
Well, we always have to, in my view, we have to look to history for the answer to any of these questions, even though history doesn't necessarily tell us what to do today. But certainly the experience of people from this region, broadly speaking, including many, many people in Russia during, and I know this as a human rights activist in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, when I was working for Amnesty International on issues in Russia. There were many people who were making decisions, not just small decisions, but sometimes big decisions, including decisions that led them into prison. And they found means of connecting with people like me and others in other countries. Again, there's a personal price to be paid, obviously, in all of these cases, and that's the terrible fact. If something is happening in an authoritarian regime, it's much more difficult to take that small action that many of us are talking about here, that each person can take. But it is still possible. And it's, I think, more possible today than ever, even though there are impediments on the digital world. I mean, it is possible because we are better connected. Now, that doesn't mean that we aren't the victims of disinformation, as I think many people are probably in Russia today and probably in other many parts of the world. But it is possible to get access to other people through the digital world that was not possible during the dissident period in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, when nonetheless, through the founding of the Helsinki process and the various ways in which people communicated at that time, there were possibilities. So I admire your question, and I hope that the answer gives you some ways of thinking about it yourself.
John, one last question, if I may, sir.
Thank you. Welcome home, John. I know we have different homes, but non-scholarly contribution is probably close to last remarks. One is, as we have many alumni who are watching it, this presentation, and many are saving the world, I would like to share their greetings to you. Many couldn't make it, obviously. We have even few alumni who came from Ukraine through Budapest and are in this audience. But as you know, we have had a great journey with you, the president, and all alumni, many across the world, are sending their greetings, and they applaud your efforts with human rights and actually welcome you here at CU. And another, as you can recall, our traditional group picture, I know that we have tight schedule, but if at all possible, especially with Sotiris, our magnificent photographer, whoever would like maybe to stay on here on the stage for a few minutes just to take a group picture. And I know that half of the group, disregarding the titles, are CU alumni here, so students, alumni, and stuff. I think it would be great to have it for our memory and for people who couldn't join us. Welcome back.
Brief comment and welcome, Serge, and thank you for all that you do for CEU and have done for so many years. And I just want to remember very fondly several, I think at least one, maybe there were more than one, I can't remember whether there were, trips that we made together to Ukraine, and particularly to Kiev. And there, I have to say, and this is hopefully an inspiration to our Ukrainian students here, the most enthusiastic group of alumni that I met almost anywhere in Europe were in Ukraine. And this was back just about the time that some of the problems were beginning to develop in Donbass and Luhansk in the 2014 area, I think, although it may have been just before that, actually, now that I think of it. So a special shout out to the alumni of CEU in Ukraine. Thank you, Serge, for what you do.
So John, before we close, maybe one public announcement in your presence. It's been made at the last town hall, but I think it'll please you. The Open Society Prize this year will be awarded to the 5 a.m. Coalition in Ukraine, which is the coalition of non-governmental organizations working on the ground to document all the war crimes and crimes against humanity. So I think that goes towards the political agenda, which is so dear to your heart. With that, I'd like to close with a word of thanks to all friends, colleagues, and former students who are admirers of John, who have contributed to making the John Shattuck Center a success. We have more than 130 donations from people who helped to establish the center and to nurture it. A special word of thanks, of course, to Martin and to his colleagues for Martin's leadership and for shaping the center and for coming up with the idea that the center should evolve, metamorphose into something different from the original idea with which it was conceived in order to keep with the times, but very much still in continuity with your vision and your ideals. Last word of thanks here to 3 former members of our board of trustees who have chaired the initiative for funding the center, and that is Ben Heinemann, Kati Martin, and Matthew Nimitz, all of them close friends of yours who have helped us and the CU to build the center. So this is a warm word of appreciation for all of their efforts. And thank you so much for making the trip to Europe, especially to see you in its new home. And now you've got a chance to see us in a temporary home. And I hope you'll be able to see us in a more permanent home in Vienna soon. Thank you.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, if you would like to move for the picture, go ahead. And then afterwards, we will move across the hallway to the reception at Cafe Estrato. You just cross and it's the door here on the right-hand side.